Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Kind Community Show. I'm Robin. I'm the copywriter here at Kind Community. We share the stories of founders, activists, and influencers promoting positivity and protection of our planet, discussing how collaboration can help make it sustainable, attainable, and accessible for all. Now, on today's episode, we have Jacob Wedderburn-Day, co-founder of Impact Calculator and all-round climate motivator Treepoints. Empowering those with information about their impact, Treepoints is making it easy to offset your yearly carbon footprint in a simple subscription package, and we love it at Kind Community. Today we'll be getting to know Jacob, his motivations, Treepoints itself and how it works, and also his own personal offsetting journey and how he became involved in sustainability. Jacob, hello, how are you?
Hi, Robin. How you doing? Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. Right, so I guess we'll sort of jump straight into it. Can you tell us a little bit about your very first introduction to offsetting, how you got involved in sustainability?
Yeah, sure. It's a bit of a roundabout story, but basically the short answer is it was due to the pandemic. So me and my co-founder were running a travel startup, which was going really well, as you can imagine, right up until March 2020. It was a very quiet year last year. And basically, we were like, we've got loads of time on our hands. We want to do something good, have an impact. I think it's a little bit of a cliche that entrepreneurs, they use their first startup to kind of get financial security. And then they're like, cool, now I can focus on stuff I care about. And I feel like we've slightly skipped step one there. But we were like, let's cut to step two anyway. We'll never have this opportunity with time again. Climate change is something we've always been personally quite interested in, but I guess, and I'm sure this is true for a lot of people, you care about it, you see it on the news, but unless it's your day job, you don't really make enough time to educate yourself about it and actually, do more than sort of the fairly limited steps around like sort of recycling and everything else that you might do in your life. So we kind of threw ourselves into researching it, and we're tech entrepreneurs, so we're like, what can we build? What can we sort of MVP, and how do we go from there?
I guess in a way, Treepoints then became something where it's like a facilitator, where those people who don't have much time can then sort of say, okay, well, Treepoints is like a good way of, sort of joining. In fact, before we continue, can you just give a sort of like rundown for our viewers about what Treepoints does, sort of how it works, sort of the very simple,
Yeah, of course. I guess there's kind of two parts to it, which is that on the one hand, we've got a service for individuals, everyday people, you and me. And then the other hand, we have one for businesses. In both cases, what we're trying to do is make climate action easy and accessible, and also provide education around that. So on the personal side, you'll notice if you ever go on our website, that's treepoints.green, the first thing you'll see is like a little calculator, and that walks you through the process of like, what's your diet like? How much do you travel? Basic questions. It's not meant to be overly complicated. And I think it's easy to get bogged down in like the sort of precision of details. It's actually better to get a general sense of what your impact is, because that gives you context. And then if you like, on Treepoints, we basically curate a portfolio of excellent environmental services and crisis schemes. And that's a mixture of carbon offsetting projects, but also tree planting, ocean plastic recycling. One of the ways we wanted to differentiate ourselves a little bit, obviously we're not the first to be doing this, but we wanted to differentiate ourselves by kind of curating, I guess, a basket of like all environmental goods, because there's lots of facets of protecting the environment and climate change that people care about. And we wanted to bring as many of those together into quite a nice subscription, if you like. And that's the individual model. For businesses, it's kind of similar. The difference there is just that we also built an API that they can integrate to trigger these things in a more sophisticated way. So the classic example is obviously plant a tree per sale, and we provide the technology that facilitates that, as well as linking them to the projects. But yeah, it's pretty cool. It's quite versatile. They can do almost anything they want with it. They could recycle plastic every time someone downloads an app, for example. So I quite like the potential that has in terms of like, I think it gives you the opportunity to be quite creative in the way you do your sustainability.
Yeah, I think you're right as well. There is a lot of potential with this kind of match up with tech and the environment. I think it's something that people are becoming a bit more aware of now, and so implementing the two, integrating them is a really, it's a hot new thing. It's great. So also, I mean, congratulations on becoming a finalist in the Startup Magazine's UK Startup of the Year.
Thank
Very
you.
impressive. Now, businesses that are ethically minded and driven by climate positivity are important to highlight, of course. But how do you think we should confront the sort of big businesses that are not as eco-conscious as Treepoints? I mean, I know you mentioned that there's sort of business integration for Treepoints, but what's the kind of approach that you think we should be taking?
And are you talking about us in terms of like the general public, or us as in like sort of Treepoints who are trying to engage these businesses to do more?
Honestly, both. Let's start with the public.
Start with the general public. I think the job of the general public is in some ways getting easier than ever in terms of, maybe I'm being a little bit biased and a little bit like Europe centric, but I do feel like this year the effects of climate change are more in your face than ever. I know we're going to talk about the IPCC report in a bit, so I won't get into detail there, but I feel like it's becoming more and more real, more and more sort of vivid, and I think that creates naturally quite a lot of pressure on businesses. I think it becomes a case of, I don't like to rely too much on sort of people changing their behavior. I think it's an important step, and I think we'll talk about that a lot as well. Ultimately, you do want businesses to kind of make these changes anyway and make it easy for consumers. And I think that's naturally already there's a kind of pressure for businesses to differentiate themselves on this basis. That's going to be interesting. That's kind of changing, because I think a lot of the early movers have already done that. But it's a case of, if you get enough momentum, then the rest are kind of playing catch up, and then they will, they don't want to be left behind. They don't want to be looking unsustainable. So I think just naturally, partly in the way that people shop and behave and consume things, it creates that pressure. The more we talk about it, the more media attention it gets. I think sometimes it can sound like, it can sound like just talk, but I think these little things actually add up to genuine sort of changes, and it makes politicians, all these things kind of add up to, it gets politicians talking about it. It gets business leaders in board meetings, like discussing how these things will happen. So I think, in little ways that adds up. And I think Treepoints more directly, we can have an impact, because we are literally, we're trying to pitch to businesses all the time and persuade them that sustainability is no longer a nice to have, it's a need to have. Sorry, I don't know if we're cut out there. It's frozen on my side, which means I'm probably frozen to you.
Yes. Yeah. And that's all right for our viewers. It seems to be okay, so I will continue.
Cool. You're back for me. Thanks.
Okay,
sorry.
Nice. Yeah, but that's a necessity, is a big thing that we believe in at Kind Community, is that it's no longer sort of a luxury or a nice to have kind of thing to be sustainable, totally. But there's a huge pressure and a necessary one as well. Now, you're not just the founder of Treepoints, but you're also the CEO and co-founder of Stasher. Could you give us a bit of background to what that is, and does that business have a relation to sustainability, or is there some sort of integration into Treepoints? How does that work?
Good question. Yeah. So as I mentioned to begin with, Stasher is the travel business that we were running pre-pandemic. There is a relationship in the sense that, obviously we run both, and Stasher itself, I guess, it's never been like explicitly sort of about sustainability. We've always, at the same time, the idea is to make it easier for people not to take sort of excessive journeys, to sort of provide convenience on their travels. So it's not like not sustainable either. And we always use like recycled materials where we do stuff. So it's been sort of vaguely conscious. Obviously, as soon as we set up Treepoints, we made sure Stasher was like, carbon neutral in all but like the official certification. So we do all the offsetting. I think the nice thing about software companies generally, to be fair, is that their footprints are relatively quite low anyway. The flight calculator you mentioned is interesting. That was just a feature we rolled out on Treepoints for fun. It was just like, because we'd built the other calculator anyway, we were like, let's calculate your carbon footprint. That links quite nicely to Stasher. And actually, now that travel's starting to pick up and we're putting more attention back on Stasher again, we're looking at that sort of more explicit integration where we can help people offset their flights, and of course plant trees and do other things when they book their storage, which is nice. What is interesting though, and I know you talked about like the inspiration for this coming from Stasher. Kind of yes and no. I did become more and more conscious of the environment when the pandemic hit, and after the sort of initial panic subsided, one of the things that fascinated me was the all the news stories about like the environment kind of coming back to life, you know, like cities becoming more, you know, natural life kind of feeding back into cities. And I think the effect of like the sort of quieting of human movement on the environment was just so stark. It was so clear. And that gave me like a slightly weird sense of guilt, because I was like desperate for people to be traveling again for Stasher's sake. And I think that was probably for both of us something that played on our minds as the year progressed. And we were like, obviously we're really keen to travel, but this has really driven home a need to sort of travel in a sustainable way. And I think really kind of piqued our own interest in sustainability more explicitly.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting debate, because on the one hand, you have, you know, trying to live more sustainably and not fly and this kind of thing, or take other sort of means of transport and this kind of thing. But then there's also, okay, well, maybe we should adapt to those things we already do and make the normative versions of those sustainable. In a way, it's like the sort of building back green of cities and making sort of more cycle lanes and this kind of stuff. So we're still going to travel around cities. We're still going to have to navigate, but let's do it in a sort of sustainable way. And it's interesting. I'm excited to see sort of what happens and how that sort of relationship with Stasher and develops. Yeah, no, it's good, and you're absolutely right. Especially with more people want to travel now. That, I mean, flight tickets are going to be dirt cheap. Everyone is sort of so it's a good opportunity.
Yeah, it's a really interesting time. I think you're right. I mean, my ideal would be like if we can advance the sort of technologies around travel to just make them more eco-friendly. I think there's a certain amount of travel that I guess is kind of luxury, but actually I think a lot of travel is it's a really positive thing. I'd sort of hate to like reduce sort of the amount people travel beyond a certain point in terms of I think it's a really enriching experience generally. Also, like you say, I mean, there's a lot of travel that happens sort of within cities and within countries that's totally necessary. So we desperately need technologies to kind of improve, and it's a balancing act, isn't it? You also want people to be, I'm sure there are people who like sort of fly jets all over the place who could probably do a bit less, but
there's a limit.
I personally, I'm quite a big fan of just taking the train when I go on holiday, so that's what I'm sort of about in the future.
Yeah, no, completely. So obviously one of the big things about Treepoints, and I guess it's in the name, is that there's a sort of point system or sort of gifting system for this kind of sustainable action, this kind of thing. But do you think that incentivizing climate action through the gifting of these points is a strong way to drive behavioral change? Because behavioral change is, of course, a sort of a long-lasting one, and it sort of really develops some roots. And so if we can get people's behaviors, and usually the world sort of around it will too. And do you think, you know, offsetting methods like Treepoints will help with that?
So I guess a few different ways of answering this question. I think to be completely candid, the sort of nudge theory approach that we've taken in terms of if you give people like extrinsic incentives, you give them like, hey, here's a gift card if you do this thing. I think you've seen it work in other areas. I think the applications of it can be really positive. In our case, I think the jury's still out. We're still kind of in that testing phase of, is this something that like, is this the sort of prime motivator that get people to sign up? Or is it actually a more intrinsic desire that sort of tips them over the edge? Is it that sort of, you know, sense of duty, sense of wanting to do good? Does that extrinsic motive possibly even contradict that sense of doing good? Like if you're sort of rewarding people for doing this, does that in any way take away from that? I hope that's not the case, but we're still basically kind of testing that and trying to understand what is the most effective way of getting people to take action. As for the sort of, the kind of snowball effect of lots of little actions adding together, I think that is unquestionably powerful. So whether or not this is the right way to tip it into action, I'm not sure. What I do really like about it, just I guess as a marketing technique, if nothing else, is that it's allowed us to build relationships with really cool companies who, you know, whereas it might be difficult to open those doors to say, hey, can we offset for you? Can we calculate stuff for you? Blah, blah, blah. If you go to them and say, hey, we'd like to sell on your gift cards, it's it's a great way to sort of build those connections. And actually that for us has been a really great way to sort of grow the business kind of from grassroots into where we are now. So Yeah, lots of positives to take. I'll be very interested to see. If you look at stuff like Sweatcoin, I don't know if you're familiar with them. They're like a sort of foot tracker, and every step you take generates like sweat coins, and ultimately you can sort of exchange these coins for things on like a sort of health marketplace. So it was a very similar, like that was quite a big source of inspiration for us, and it's a similar idea there. And I think from the outside they seem to be doing well. I guess you can never believe too much PR, but that's I think there's lots of good evidence in favor of this kind of thing working, and I'll let you know how it goes.
Yeah. I think it's good, even just as a sort of feeling like there's a reward, which is true. Maybe it's contradictory. Maybe the reward is the fact that you get to keep Earth. You're not going to go extinct. But in a way, this kind of like short-term thing where it's like, okay, cool. Like it's a nice way of visualizing some change that you might have made, or just sort of getting something back. And I think for maybe people who are just starting their climate positive journey, maybe it's quite a nice way of sort of getting in. And then as you learn more, it's like, okay, cool, well, I'm going to go off my own accord and do these things and make these changes in my life, maybe without needing those incentives. Maybe the incentive just comes totally from within. It's different for everyone. But yeah, no, it would be great. It would be great to hear how it goes. I'm sure it's going to be great.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think what you describe is like it's definitely a psychological effect of nudge theory, in that if you can kind of do enough to sort of tip people into a certain behavior type, they then develop an image of themselves that's a little bit like, then stuff you offer them becomes more consistent with that image. So once someone starts doing this, even if it's like, you know, a case of Brewdog beer that gets them to sign up, at that point they sort of see themselves as someone who's eco-conscious because they're subscribing to these things, and that can spill over into, exactly as you say, all sorts of other like positive behavioral change and advocacy. So yeah, fingers crossed, man.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Brewdog, because it was just yesterday that I saw they released the world's first carbon negative beer, I think it was, which blew my mind, because I just hadn't sort of thought about it in a beer before, just that whole process. And it's this quite elegant sort of dark carbon colored kind of bottle.
Oh, their design is really strong, isn't it? Their design
So I'd be interested to see what the pickup on that is, because when you're ordering a pint or something, you're not thinking, what's the carbon impact of this? But now Brewdog's kind of made that a bit more aware for me. So yeah. It's also, I suppose, it's an excuse to drink, isn't it? If you know the environment.
I was talking to some friends about this, and actually I could kind of see this effect being the case, which is that, like you say, you don't, the first thing you think of when you think about choosing a beer is not the carbon footprint. But if you've got people like Brewdog and enough other people sort of starting to think about it, it will, I think, tip you away from the guys that aren't doing that. And then that's kind of the effect we spoke about earlier. I think that's when you start to sort of get that kind of pressure to be part of the group, and more people will do it. Because I think in absence of other sort of differentiators, the fact that Brewdog are carbon negative is actually something quite persuasive when you're like, oh, which beer shall I go for?
Yeah, absolutely. So moving on to the IPCC report now, which sort of in the wake of all this, it seems to have enlightened some of the blind spots in climate action. A greater number of people are now more aware of the urgency that we're talking about, urgency of the climate crisis. And there is that hint of sort of legislative governmental plans on the horizon for change. And I suppose in a way we've sort of talked about this a bit already, but do you think that long-lasting change is more likely to come from those individuals doing their part, or from the sort of corporations? Which one comes first? Is it sort of an equal balance, this kind of thing? And I guess sort of following from that as well, does Treepoints give us as individuals more opportunity to sort of participate in action?
A very good question. I think our sort of philosophy on this is that large institutions don't change until the public demand is palpable and the crisis is urgent enough that individual efforts are needed in the interim. So if you look at people like Ecosia, for example, they're planting billions of trees, and that definitely adds up to something really quite significant. But that billion that they reach is on the basis of loads of individual people making individual searches, which on their own can seem possibly a little bit token, but the overall effect is really powerful. And I think Treepoints is basically looking to operate in exactly the same way and galvanize that kind of effect. So make it easy, make it accessible for people to make change. I mean, we're not operating at that level of sort of millions or billions yet, but we're well into like tens of thousands. And again, that's the sort of thing that like it's a small change, but it adds up into something quite meaningful. And I think that's where you get quite a powerful effect going on.
Yeah, certainly. I think as well, with this sort of like putting pressure on large corporations as individuals creates a sort of sense of movement. And I think one of the things about the IPCC report is it left a lot of us feeling a bit sort of down. It's like, okay, well, you know,
it was a bit depressing.
Yeah, you know, and it's kind of, it makes you think, well, you know, what's the point now? It's over. But the reality is that, you know, coming together now and sort of creating some sort of guiding force, setting an example for these corporations as individuals or as a group. Very powerful, very powerful. It gives us a lot of agency in a way. And obviously, you know, there's the things like voting and this kind of stuff, but there's a bit more that we can use our voices, this kind of thing, and drive some quite positive change. And I really think that people like, you know, Treepoints, you know, it can help facilitate that kind of stuff as well.
I hope so, and I think it's possibly the implication of the question, and I think I've seen this before, is there are people who are skeptical of like stuff that they see as almost sort of tokenistic action, like you sort of plant a single tree for this kind of thing on its own, not significant. But I think the analogy with voting is maybe not a bad one. Like individual votes have exactly the same feeling, but the overall result is democracy, which is significant. And in the case of this, I think this is how, you know, you do build up to like significant sort of response. But the IPCC report was so interesting because I think before they've had much more like couch language around these kind of things. It's been a lot more sort of like, I don't know, less stark, less kind of like bleak, really. But I think you kind of need that. It's kind of the kick that I think the world needs to really like pay attention, especially once the pandemic kind of subsides out of the sort of center focus of the news cycle. Climate change surely has to be the dominant crisis that we pay attention to. In complete agreement with that. Complete agreement.
Now, this is a slightly, maybe not for you, but for me, it's a harder question maybe to understand. But your background is of course in economics.
Yes.
Now, what economic models are there that you think are sort of reasonably adoptable and more importantly suitable for a future that's climate positive? And if you can, please explain in words that someone who's never studied economics can understand.
I'll do my best. There are two. One I studied and one I never studied, but it's a book I've read recently that I'm quite interested in. The first one I think most people will be familiar with in concept is like carbon credits. I think basically the idea is that carbon emissions are what they call in economics an externality. So it's like it's an unintended consequence of stuff sort of happening in the market, demand and supply. You sell something, the process of selling that thing, making that thing emits carbon. Carbon isn't priced into the good that you sell. This is kind of what economics identifies as like a problem, and they call it an externality. But they're like, really, if, you know, because the pollution affects everyone else, it doesn't affect the firm directly, you don't take account of it. This is a problem. And what they do to try and rectify that is these sort of carbon credits, carbon taxes, where you do try and build that into the price by taxing people, but firms have like a certain amount of license to pollute. So credits, firms that are good at improving their technology so they pollute less can sell their credits to other firms. That's quite a nice way of kind of cashing in on the fact that they've done well. Firms that are really pollutative can at least buy credits from other firms, although what you then do overall to kind of improve things is restrict the supply of credits on the market. I hope I'm not getting like too complex there, but the idea is that you can kind of like permit a certain amount of pollution and then slowly rein in the total number. And that is kind of like over time, that should incentivize firms to sort of behave appropriately. So I always really liked that model. And I think possibly the challenge with it is just like introducing that on a global scale. And I think, to be honest, that's the biggest challenge with climate change altogether, is that it requires a certain amount of global cooperation. You can do very well as a sort of country individually, but you're relatively a small part of that global sort of polluting effect, unless you're China. And so it's about kind of bringing everyone together under the same system, and that's tricky. So that was the main one, to be fair. Another one that I really like, but I won't go into too much detail on, is have you come across a book called Donut Economics?
Oh, I have heard of it, and it's been on my to-read list for
nice.
many months now. I haven't got around to it.
Oh,
yes,
sweet.
no, I have heard
Yeah,
of it.
I'll just briefly plug that. I didn't write it or anything, but I mean, I'll plug it in the sense that like I like the model. I think the traditional sort of economic model of like how you measure output and success in an economy is just like how much you produce, right? And I think obviously it's very, very clear that that means there's an incentive to grow and produce more, and none of that takes into account the effect you have on the environment. And the model in donut economics, they have this sort of graph shaped like a donut, hence the name, where it's not about being as far away from the center point as possible. It's about being in this like ring of sustainability. It's like, this is actually an appropriate amount to produce that is like, sustainable, takes account of all these things that we care about environmentally, takes account of other issues too, like sort of education factors, well-being, all sorts of other things. It's I think it's just a more like holistic, coherent model of like what we're aiming for as a society, rather than just like produce as much as possible. So really cool idea.
That sounds great. And I think that actually that holistic approach is a very, very important one, because sustainability really does affect every part of our lives, from, making your coffee in the morning to, flying to Madrid. It's kind of like this, very, very broad scale of things. And everything we do really does have an impact. Am I right in thinking that the model you mentioned before is with the sort of carbon credits, is that similar at all to sort of a sugar tax? But it's a bit more complicated version of it.
No, in essence, it really is. I think the only, it's again, I mean, it's that sort of fundamental theory of like taxing stuff is that sugar produces negative outcomes like obesity, et cetera, et cetera. If that's not priced into the good that you buy, the chocolate, whatever, then people are going to consume all this stuff more than they should because it's cheap and all the negative consequences that follow. And a sugar tax is a way of addressing that. And I think the only difference with the carbon credit scheme is just that people can't trade their like the amount the amount of sugar they use if they sort of find ways to restrict it. So that's kind of like the next step on top of that, which is just a cool model. But similar in principle for sure, at least fundamentally.
And that sounds promising. So I think, I mean, we kind of talked a lot about this before, but do you have any plans for Treepoints to help mitigate carbon emissions before they're created, rather than just sort of reducing the need to offset? Because one of the sort of big things at the moment is, of course, about saving trees before they're cut down and then having to replant. Is there sort of a part of Treepoints that does that?
It's a really good question. So yes, in a couple of senses. One is that the portfolio projects we support, we've been doing a lot of work kind of thinking about like which projects we do want to support. Basically came up with sort of a matrix model of like, okay, these are the sort of the risks. Without going into too much detail, there's all sorts of risks associated with backing carbon offsetting projects. The main one is just what they call additionality, which is just that, could the same credit be resold to other people? Is there like a risk of fraud? Basically, there has been like a history of that kind of stuff. And I think especially nowadays where there's so much attention turning to carbon offsetting and all these projects, again, you have that kind of like gold rush market dynamic, and you have to just be careful of these kind of things. So obviously we look for risks like that, but we're also really, really keenly interested in like sort of maximizing impact. What is the stuff that's going to be the most effective? As you mentioned, I think there's a lot to be said around like sort of conserving and preserving what's already there. And when you are looking at sort of planting projects, making sure that that is done in the most sensible way, ecologically speaking, like you're planting the right kind of trees in the right kind of places. There's all sorts of details you can go into on that. So yeah, definitely yes to that part. The second thing that we're doing, which I think also answers the question, is for businesses, what we're trying to do is, again, that education piece, like help them understand their impact more widely. And the moral, to be fair, always with Treepoints is like, number one is always reduce. There's obviously kind of, I guess, two sides to how it all works. Reduce stuff, and then you're emitting less into the atmosphere. And then obviously offset what you can't. I think the fact of removals being really important is basically because there is just so much in the atmosphere already. So like, I know there's a lot of people who, they prefer just to go like 100% reduction, not worry too much about the offsetting element. Or I guess that's the kind of, you've got people like Greenpeace who are concerned about offsetting being a bit of a license to pollute, because they're like, you should be looking at your lifestyle first. Totally agree with that. It's very important. But yeah, there's so much that's in the atmosphere at the moment anyway. So we definitely like removal technologies, be they natural like trees or the more like sophisticated carbon capture stuff that people are investigating at the moment.
There are
When
some
that
very
becomes
interesting
more
new
viable, we'll
technologies
look
for
at backing
that as
those.
well.
Yeah.
I mean, there was I can't remember the name of it quite now, but I remember seeing it was just sort of a simple box that you could place in your house or in your garden, and it would be it would sort of bring in carbon and much like a tree would,
Oh, sweet.
and sort of clean your local area. And the idea is that everyone would have some of these kind of things situated. So in a way, this kind of like after the mitigating the things that you can't stop doing, all this kind of the pollution that's out there already. I think they had this kind of dream where so everyone would have one of these, and then the sort of community would become greener, and the sort of like microclimate around it would be a bit more healthy to be in, less polluted, this kind of stuff. And so it seems that maybe the technology is kind of still catching up to that. And I think as well, it's interesting with regards to sort of digital technologies, because I think there's things like flying, right? People understand it has a big impact, this kind of stuff.
Yeah, quite a visual when it's easy to imagine like the jet fuel coming out the back of planes.
Exactly. It's very easy to comprehend. But then you have things like, we're running your computers and these kind of things, and websites and our phones and all this kind of big servers out there, and the cloud things. Very difficult to visualize because essentially it's sort of invisible to us. And in a way, it feels like some part of that education, part of the narrative and the dialogue around that space is still catching up. And how do we mitigate digital impact in the first place, or how do we reduce that with all this information out there that's not even being used? How do we then delete that forever? It's a big and evolving issue.
Yeah, it's massive. It is really interesting. I was reading into this recently, but I need to understand it better myself. But I've seen that a lot of the a lot of the sort of giant cloud providers, Amazon, Microsoft, etc., they are committing those services to be fully green. I just need to understand what they mean when they say that. I don't know how much of that is just down to offsetting and how much is
tree.
Exactly. And then you've got Bezos shooting his rocket anyway. So I don't know, but they do look like they're taking steps to mitigate that. Yeah, it is interesting. It is interesting. As you say, there's a lot of invisible effects that go on around you, and I think when they're less visual, they kind of easily more go under the radar. But there's effects happening all the time.
Now, you mentioned just briefly then as well about the portfolio, and I just wanted to say that we love the transparency that Treepoints has with its operations, because visitors to your site can see how you purchase this sort of carbon offsetting and visualize the breakdown of it via a public ledger, and the sort of projects in there create your portfolio. But how do you sort of pick and choose those projects? Is there sort of a criteria that you sort of go through and say, okay, well, this project is best suited for this? How does that work?
I'm very glad you asked that, because this is something we've basically spent the last 3 months like really focused on. So we spoke to some academics, some climate scientists, a few consultants, just like kind of wanted to take a range of opinions so that we could basically formulate our own kind of, we call it the mission statement. It's live on our blog. I can share a link with you afterwards for the show notes.
That'd be brilliant, yes.
But yeah, the mission statement basically brings all this stuff together in terms of like, okay, what is our sort of philosophy around climate change and how do we pick the projects? And to give you a sort of condensed version of that answer, one, we've always said we like the kind of broad scale, like suite of environmental actions approach. I know there's lots of services dedicated to carbon offsetting specifically, but in our case, we really like the fact that we're able to do trees, plastic, a variety of different offsetting approaches. It's not just like look at the cheapest ones, which would be sort of wind farms in China, for example. It's about like taking into account more than that. The second aspect, I think, is something we feel quite strongly about is when we do pick those kind of projects, we specifically look at stuff that meets the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I can't remember how many of them there are now. I think they started with 14. I don't know if there's like 18 or 21. There's some number.
Yeah, I think it's
and yeah, they're all very like, can't think of a better word than like nice, but they're nice goals. They're stuff that we should be working towards, stuff that we feel like kind of, passionately about. And it's great to pick projects that I think meet those. So when we're looking at tree planting, for example, it's about, okay, are these projects well run in such a way that they actually afford good employment opportunities for people in the communities where we're working? Stuff like that. Does it help address kind of, you look at like the cook stoves project, and that helps address issues around sort of hunger. You've got stuff around like clean water access as well. So it's there's a lot of other sort of facets that come into choosing these that I think kind of round the portfolio quite nicely. And I mentioned the additionality risk as well. Obviously, that's the other big one, is just like making sure that the projects are as sort of verified and audited as they say they are. Because I think as Treepoints, especially working with businesses, but also working with individuals, one of the roles we see ourselves fulfilling is that kind of like verified middleman in terms of like, trust us because we've researched and curated these to be as sort of honest as possible. So
it's wonderful as well that it's not just the sort of planting of trees, it's the removal of plastic, and it's a more humanitarian approach, because ultimately sustainability for humans is more than just the environment. It's about finding what works on a long-term scale
100%.
and vision for us as humans. So it's wonderful to see that you're sort of bringing that into your portfolio as well, so that it becomes a sort of a slightly bigger thing than just going green,
Yeah, I should say, if anyone listening or if you yourself have like ideas of other things that you'd like to see us support, or know really good charities operating more broadly in the space, we're always happy to kind of work to include these projects and bundle them in. Because like I say, I think the vision that we really like is that we're not just a carbon offsetting service. I think, if anything, the interesting thing about carbon offsetting is it's probably the most abstract of the kind of things that we provide. Like you say, it's not always totally visual what you mean when you talk about carbon offsetting. Whereas planting a trees at least has quite a tangible effect. Removing plastic bottles from the ocean, again, it's something that I think people can kind of like relate to on a more sort of visual level. I think that's quite a powerful thing. And I love the idea of like bringing all of these services together into one place. So you feel like you're getting like, you're having a nice wide impact with the subscription donation you're making.
So what is next then for Treepoints? Is there any sort of big things on the horizon? Maybe some of the things we've spoken about today are sort of, we'll see them popping up in a month's time.
So short-term and long-term. Short-term answer, one of the things that we're looking to do, I mean, we kind of bootstrapped this project as something originally just to keep us busy, and then something we've got more passionate about, and it's something that's like snowballed to the point that it's actually become quite a meaningful project. And so we're looking to kind of formalize that in the sense of like, it'd be great to raise a little bit of money just so that we can now like hire a proper team around us to basically professionalize it, take it more seriously, bring in more business clients, improve the features for our existing users. Short term, there'll be a lot of action happening in that respect. More interestingly, sort of long-term vision, definitely, I mean, like I said, always looking to support as many interesting things as we can, drive as much as we can to the existing partners that we're working with, and roll out interesting features. One of the things will be for businesses. We've been working on like a calculator to help cover your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. That's like the definition of those is probably too complicated to go into. You can look it up, but like it basically, that's something that you require to be carbon neutral or net zero if you want to make like a specific sort of certified claim. So one of the things we've found from talking to businesses we work with is that generally is something they're looking to. Net zero is becoming more and more of a popular thing. And we want to basically help people as much as we can with that journey. Looking even longer term ahead, this is getting more ambitious, but we'd love to get involved with projects specifically in terms of like starting our own. So it'd be really, really awesome to be able to like, pick the right place in the world to do these things and run our own sort of tree planting initiatives, or perhaps get more invested in some of the more ambitious carbon capture technologies that we're seeing developed in and around the world. So there are some
technologies out there. It'd be amazing to see, in the long term what it is that you end up doing, because there are some really strange things out there. I remember seeing it was a weird sort of AI bot. You place it in rivers and it will go around and collect plastic and other polluting elements and sort of bring it up, and then it sort of will come to the surface, and then and just sort of gets them properly recycled, disposed of, whatever. And it was some crazy futuristic thing. And I thought, my God, it really is sort of the future of carbon capturing and this kind of stuff. So yeah, if Treepoints come up with something like that in the future, let us know.
That's so cool. That is so cool.
Yeah. So we have a very quick fire round. Try and keep the answers as quick and rapid fire as possible. First one, how do you define sustainability?
Something, I guess, that can like perpetuate itself. It's not gonna sort of burn out or become unhealthy. It's something that you build that can last. I don't know if that's dictionary definition, but like the way that we see it is it's something that has the potential to kind of last in a healthy way.
Love that. Okay, what are you most hopeful for?
Obvious answer, overcoming climate change in the next 100 years, or at least the world still being inhabitable. More short term, the pandemic subsiding so that we can focus on climate change specifically.
Okay, and who inspires you?
Let me think of a good answer to this. To be fair, it isn't a great answer, but there are so many entrepreneurs that have achieved so much. So like the ones that spring to my mind are someone like Brian Chesky with Airbnb. Elon Musk, love him or hate him, is a very interesting dude as well. And he's invented a lot of cool technology.
His space travel is certainly questionable, but
yeah. On the one hand, electric cars, on the other hand, rockets.
Yeah, a bit all over the place.
Oh, and Bitcoin as well, Dogecoin.
Yeah, of course. And where will you be in 10 years' time?
Oh God, hopefully still here to see things on the earth. I'd love to see, Stasher in a good place with people traveling, just being like a nice, like effective, helpful business, and Treepoints hopefully being like a significant part of the climate action movement. Like I'd love to build up a really great audience of people who care about climate change. I'd love us to be in the position where we're potentially like more physically involved with projects like on the ground, doing our own kind of thing. And yeah, I'd love to see more and more businesses engaged with climate change, like the whole sort of, like paradigm of the way that we work and operate being much more sustainability focused. That'd be cool. You did say 10 years, so that's probably like super ambitious, but
yeah. Well, Jacob, thank you so much for speaking with me today. Can you please let our audience know where they can find you and how they can sort of join or collaborate with you, send you maybe ideas for the portfolios?
Yeah, of course. So you can always email me at jacob@treepoints.green. I'm on LinkedIn. The full name is Jacob Wedderburn-Day, but you should be able to find me searching for Treepoints as well. You can also reach me over on the Stasher website. Stasher is stasher.com. If you need storage when you travel, perfect for that kind of thing. Last thing to say as well is Ant, my co-founder, and I run a podcast that's called The Morality of Everyday Things. It's an everyday philosophy podcast where we talk about all sorts of issues. We did one recently on climate change, which was quite fun, which was about like, is it moral to have kids in an era of climate change? I say fun, it was quite heavy, but we try and keep these things lighthearted generally and just like look at the sort of ethical questions around these kind of issues. So yeah, all sorts of places you can find me, and super welcome to get in touch. Happy to hear anything you thought about this or feedback or ideas generally. Yeah, please do. Love to hear from you. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Jacob. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm sure to check out that podcast. Cheers, Robin. Great to talk to you too, man. Have a good one. Take care. Bye-bye. So if you enjoyed my conversation with Jacob today, please do share, like, and subscribe. We go live every Friday, and we're very much looking forward to having you with us next week. And I hope you have an absolutely wonderful weekend. Cheers. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.